There are 4 steps to this process of consistently bringing out the best in others. The first, and arguably most important step, is making this shift, moving from seeing ourselves as a boss or a manager to being a coach.
When I am at my best energized self, there's a little gap between where I am and what's optimal for me. Then that is when I'm going to produce the best result.
We're actually more likely to make the bigger impact if we have a culture where people are in fact thriving. The answer is you create the conditions for people to motivate themselves. Motivation has to be intrinsic, and that's really what inspiration is. And it's not like The Secret, right? It's not like you just read this and everything just magically changes. But what does happen is if you read this out loud,
there is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation today. So we're going to talk about what it takes to be a great leader. In fact, how do you inspire greatness? And I'm going to say, who out there doesn't want to be seen as that great leader who gets exceptional results, who inspires your team, and who leaves a powerful legacy behind? If you share that aspiration, but you're wondering what to do in a time-starved environment, then we've got answers for you today. Some actionable tips and a very clear pathway to inspiration. So my guest today is Matt Tenney. Matt has been with me before. Fabulous podcast. Recommend you check that one out as well. But Matt wants a world in which all leaders and workplace cultures consistently make a positive impact on the well-being and growth of team members. Sounds good to me. Sign me up. He's the author of 3 books. The one we're talking about today is Inspire Greatness: How to Motivate Employees with a Simple, Repeatable, Scalable Process. And you should check out his TED Talk, which has over 1 million views. Been working with all sorts of companies around the world. So, Matt, it's great to have you back again for yet another conversation.
it's my pleasure to be back, Wanda. Always a good conversation with you.
Likewise. You always surprise me in some way, so this is good. So, we talked before in the last podcast about mindfulness. Fabulous story, fabulous experience, fabulous advice. But this time we're talking about inspiration. So why are you passionate about helping managers inspire others to do great things? Where does that come from?
Well, the inspiration for me is it actually comes from my time living and training as a monk, which we talked about in our last conversation for a podcast episode. And one of the core elements of living the monastic life is that we give up our own short-term self-interest to be of greater service to others. And in many traditions, people take a vow, and one that I took as well, which is that we're devoting our lives to help end suffering in our world. And of course, I think ultimately what that comes down to is each individual has to have peace within themselves. But there are a lot of skillful means that I think can accelerate that movement, moving our society in the direction of peace. And to me, one of the most obvious ones is creating workplaces that are actually enhancing people's well-being and instead of having a negative impact on well-being. And also creating workplaces where people can actually grow and develop the most important qualities of being human, like being kind, like being generous. These things are actually good for the workplace, and they're good for business. So that's what's motivated me is this understanding that, wow, if I can work with organizations and help them create cultures where they're consistently hitting their strategic goals, they're making a big impact in terms of achieving their mission, achieving their goals, and doing it in a way that actually is creating those positive effects in the lives of employees, I think that would have a huge ripple effect in our society. Just on the well-being side alone, if people are coming home fulfilled and relaxed instead of coming home unfulfilled and stressed, that alone could do a lot to improve our society. But then if we take it a step further, and if workplace cultures are actively working on helping people cultivate the highest qualities of being human, like kindness and generosity, that of course accelerates our progress much further or much faster.
Yeah, before anybody says, yeah, but I'm here about performance and results, I want to tie what you just said about creating places where people are their best version of their self. So, first, research by Teresa Welburn on a concept she calls energy. Stay tuned, there's a podcast coming up really soon for this one as well. But the concept is when I am at my best energized self, there's little gap between where I am and what's optimal for me, then that is when I'm going to produce the best results. And it is tied to performance. It's tied to company survival. It's tied to stock market. And you have to ask yourself what gives you energy. And one of the things that gives people energy, as it turns out, is connection with other people, feeling like I'm growing and developing. All of those things that you just described ultimately lead to great performance, even if it isn't immediately obvious.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I think, there tends to be this dichotomy in many people's minds that you have to make a choice. You can either be this quote unquote high performance culture where everyone's working 80 hours a week and achieving, your goals, or you can be kind of a more relaxed workplace where you have great employee engagement or retention, but maybe you're not making as much of an impact in terms of impact on society or profit growth or revenue growth. But that dichotomy is a false one. And there's absolutely no question based on decades of research that we're actually more likely to make the bigger impact, hit the revenue targets, hit the profit targets, if we have a culture where people are in fact thriving. So the two are not only mutually exclusive, they're actually synergistic. Which I'm sure we'll get into, and how they are so interrelated.
Well, I think if anybody sits back and says, who was the person that I worked for that got me to do the most, to accelerate my performance, however you want to define that, and then tell me what it was about that leader or about that circumstance, I'm going to bet you that what they say is I was inspired. In fact, I do this game regularly with people, and the answer is always I was inspired. And always they inspired me to believe more in myself than I believed in myself. Is an interesting parallel. We could talk about this one for a while. I will say I was just with a CEO client today who said, we were talking about what his legacy was going to be, and he said, one of my big 3 things has to do with the culture that I leave behind. So if it's on the CEO's mind, it ought to be on everybody else's mind. All right, so I'm going to take the bite on this. Inspire greatness. So what is it that leaders and managers do that inspires?
Well, there are a number of things. And I think the first thing to think about is that it's not so much, there's a difference between inspiration and motivation. It's funny, like the subtitle of the book is actually How to Motivate Employees with a Simple, Repeatable, Scalable Process. But it's a bit of a misnomer because we use that actually because it has so much search volume. There's so many people looking for how do you motivate employees. And the answer is you don't. The answer is you create the conditions for people to motivate themselves. Motivation has to be intrinsic. And that's really what inspiration is when you're creating an environment where people are intrinsically motivated to be and do their best, that's inspiration. And there are a number of things that leaders do to make this happen, can or should do. But really, there's a process that people can follow, which I think is so important to point out, because I think there's this common thought, and I know I've heard lots of people say this, I'm sure you have too, but they hear something like, my job is to inspire people. And they think, well, I'm not a natural born leader. I don't have a bunch of charisma. I don't know that I could do that. And there's really good news on this front. You don't need to be highly charismatic. You don't need to be a quote unquote natural born leader. There is a process that you can follow to consistently bring out the best in people, to consistently inspire greatness in the people that you lead.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Some of the best leaders I have seen are not the obvious, bigger than life, charismatic, huge public speakers, extroverts. They're quite the polar opposite. Yes, they learn to speak on a public stage and get their message across in a compelling way, yes, but that's much more of a learned skill than it is a natural skill. And I don't think there's anything that is inherent that somebody can't learn in this whole process of leading and leading well. So it isn't big personality. I agree with you. Okay, so I got to now know, what's this algorithm? You've mentioned it twice, that it's scalable, repeatable, and simple. So give me the algorithm. Tell me how this works.
Sure. Well, why don't I give a very quick high-level introduction, and then we can go into as much detail as you like. So there are 4 steps to this process of consistently bringing out the best in others. The first, and arguably most important step, is making this shift, moving from seeing ourselves as a boss or a manager, which, I think when most people, if they think of what that means, it usually comes down to a couple of things. It's a bunch of extra admin work and telling people what to do. And that's a boss. Breaking news alert here. Nobody wants a boss. Nobody wants that, right? So we want to move from being a boss or a manager to being a coach. And as we make that move, and we can go into much more detail on that in a second, I just wanted to give you the 4 steps real quick. So as we make that move and we spend more time operating as a coach who's bringing out the best in people, then the second step becomes very obvious. Well, if I want to be a coach who brings out the best in people, I need to identify, what do people need to be and do their best? What do they need to thrive? Good news on that front is there's decades of research telling us that there are many of these needs people have that are universal, which we'll probably come back to. The third step is, once we understand what people need to thrive, we need to get regular feedback on how well we're meeting those needs as leaders, because we all have blind spots. We might think we're doing very well, and we might not be. And even if we are doing well, we can leverage those strengths and seek continuous improvement in areas that we're already doing well, which is where we're probably going to put the most energy and create the most impact. And then the fourth step is, when we get feedback from direct reports on how well we're meeting these needs people have for thriving, we need to respond to it very quickly. And by very quickly, I mean like a matter of business days, which most people, when they first hear this, their heads almost explode, because they think, holy cow, like we just got our action plans done, after our last survey, 9 months after the survey was completed, which is very common. So don't feel bad if that's your situation. But those are the 4 steps. We want to become more resilient to the pressures that make us just be a boss and be more of a coach. Understand what people need to thrive, get frequent feedback on how well we're meeting the needs people have for thriving, and then respond to that feedback very quickly with meaningful action.
Okay, that sounds repeatable. Each of those steps sounds like a tall order, though. So let's take them one by one.
Sure.
The shift from the boss manager to the coach. All right, now let me pause for a minute. I feel like we've given the label manager a bad rep. That we talk about manager as somebody who's that micro-controlling person, and that's not what you really mean. I mean, there is a piece of, you've got to give people feedback, you've got to do some admin work, you've got to do a performance system. I mean, there's all those pieces, but that's part of leading, at any rate, I would argue. So I don't want to mean the bad side of micromanaging. You mean something that's much more not controlling as it is instructive. Is that fair? By managing?
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here is making a move from being someone who tells people what to do, being someone who judges other people's performance, to being someone who co-creates goals with people, helps them decide where they want to go, and then coaches them to win. So to me, the first step, the key to making this happen, is that we need frequent reminders of what our true job is if we are a leader of people. And there is an important distinction between management and leadership, right? Management includes a lot of the things you discussed. Yes, of course, we have to do some admin things if we're in a management role. But the point is, if we're, just because we have a management title doesn't mean we need to act like a quote unquote traditional boss or manager. We can be a leader. And the shift here is moving from that traditional idea of what it means to be a manager or a boss, and instead seeing ourselves as a coach. And so I think it's very helpful to have, and there's lots of leaders who ascribe to this, we need to remind ourselves very often what our true job is. Because if you look at many job descriptions, and this is not a knock on HR teams who create the job descriptions, this is important to have all of the details in there. But what tends to happen is they kind of miss the big picture. So the first thing I recommend people do is write out, print up your current job description, and at the top of it, write out the words additional responsibilities. And then type up some variation of this and print it up and put it on top of that, which is my primary job is to inspire greatness in my team by serving as a coach who helps people to thrive. And when we start reading that over and over again, we remind ourselves, it serves a very important purpose in terms of helping us make this shift, because there are all these pressures compelling us to be more of an individual contributor, to do a lot of stuff, or to just be a quote unquote boss and tell people what to do. And it's not our own fault that this is happening. A lot of we're conditioned to operate that way. We're conditioned by much of society to think that winning is more important, hitting short-term goals and metrics is more important than creating the conditions for long-term success, which involves coaching and developing people. But also just the way our brains are wired. We are wired literally neurobiologically. It's like when we execute and we hit a short-term goal, even if it's something as simple as cleaning out the email inbox, guess what happens? You get this little hit of an opioid neurotransmitter that makes you feel good, because it's an opioid, right? And then, but it's very short-lived, and it goes away, and guess what replaces it? Dopamine. Dopamine comes in and says, hey, here's some energy to go do that again, because that felt good. Go do that again. And this is how almost all addictive cycles are created. It's just this simple loop of getting a high, having the high go away, having dopamine compelling us to go get that high again. And it can give you a lot of energy, but the problem is it's very addictive. And so we can get in these cycles where we spend a lot of time looking for these short-term victories, things that are very easy to measure, and we overlook the things that are not urgent but are very important and that create long-term success. So that's why I think I know it might have sounded a little cheesy of like rewriting your job description, reading it. I even recommend reading it out loud a couple times a day. It can help build resilience to these pressures that we're describing.
So Matt, I want to go back to something that you said. You were talking about the importance of writing at the top of your job description that your real job description, above all the technical components, is to inspire greatness in the team by coaching them so that they thrive. Why do you think that's so important to write at the top of your job description?
Well, because we face so many pressures that compel us to not operate in that way. So for one, we're conditioned through many aspects of society to put winning first, right? Particularly short-term wins, where we hit these short-term goals and objectives. We're conditioned to think that way, just kind of naturally. But then on top of it, we get wired that way very easily in the workplace through habit formation, and it's literally neurobiologically this happens where, every time we get some short-term win, even if it's something as simple as like cleaning out your email inbox, you get this hit of an opioid neurotransmitter that makes you feel good, but it doesn't last very long. And so then dopamine comes in and gives you this energy that's basically compelling you to go do that again. The brain says, I want to feel that high feeling again, and it can become very addictive. And so in order to build some resilience to these pressures, and some of us have literal, real pressures, particularly if you're a publicly traded CEO, and you have a lot of pressure to hit short-term quarterly profit targets, for instance. Most CEOs are basically on a 90-day mandate if they're a publicly traded company. If they're not profitable every 90 days, they're on the short list to be replaced by somebody else, right? So we have external pressures, we have conditioning, and we have this habit formation that has happened neurobiologically that compels us to look for just short-term execution, short-term wins. And then what happens is we're avoiding, sometimes for weeks or months, the things that don't give us short-term hits, but create the conditions for long-term success. Things like coaching and developing people. So when we we print up this job description. We read it a couple times a day, ideally out loud. I know that might sound a little silly, almost like it's the secret or something, but it's not like you just read it and everything changes. What happens is you read it, and then for at least a couple minutes, you're thinking about what are some things I could do continue making this shift? What are some things I could do right now to help bring out the best in my team members? And then when you take those little micro actions, that starts undoing the conditioning. That's what literally rewires the brain. And for anyone thinking that, like, oh man, that sounds like it's a little bit beneath me. I've been leading for a long time. I just want to share a quick anecdote. I became friends a year and a half or so ago with the longtime CEO of WD-40. His name is Gary Ridge. By almost every metric, he's one of the best CEOs we've seen in the United States in the last 50 years. And the first time I met him, I remember at the end of our conversation, I noticed he had this notebook and it had all these bullets on it. I think there were 12 of them. And I said, Gary, what are those bullets? And he said, oh, these are my reminders of who I want to be as a human being and as a leader. I read them every day, usually multiple times every day. I asked him, what are these bullets? He read them out. And if I were to summarize them for you, it was basically my job is to inspire greatness in the people around me by serving as a coach who helps people to thrive. And just in a little bit more detail in the 12 bullets. So I'm just going to throw this out there. That one of the most successful CEOs of the last 50 years, who had been a CEO at that point for over 20 years, still reminds himself every day, often multiple times every day, of what his true job is. Maybe it's not a bad idea for us to do that.
Maybe a good idea to try. Yeah, I think there are many things that have gotten in the way. I think I agree with you about the dopamine hit, and I agree with you about the short-term pressures, and I agree with you with the pressures from above or from the board if you're the CEO. So it feels like I got to do it right now. But there's also this thing I find that people like to be the hero. You bring me the problem and I have the solution. Yay! And that, while that doesn't make you a command and control in the classic sense, it gets you right back in that, well, let me tell you what to do to solve the problem with the best of intentions. And that has its own second-hand problem that comes along. So I know that there are a lot of pressures. So, and I know we know that we shouldn't be doing that, but I don't think we stop to find all the ways in which we are doing it.
I'm actually not sure about that, Wanda. I think senior people know that. I think very often junior people, when they first get promoted to be a leader of others, sadly, most people have had zero training on how to do that. They got promoted to be a leader of others because they were good at their jobs, or because they've been around a long time, or some combination thereof. And they don't realize that one of the key moves you need to make to be effective as a leader is your job is no longer to be the hero. Your job is to build other heroes, right? Your job is to lead a team of heroes, bringing a team together so that they can succeed and be a heroic team. And that's challenging. I mean, think about if you're a star A player and you're used to all the praise and accolades that come with being really good, to then say, well, now my job is to sit back, and anytime there's praise, to make sure my team gets that, not me. And anytime there's criticism, make sure I get that and not my team. That's tricky. That takes some practice and some training.
Tricky. All right. So describe to me what coaching looks and feels like. You said earlier that we're co-creating goals, that I'm doing whatever it is that people need to do to thrive and to be inspired. Can you give me any more kind of description of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, it's funny you bring this up, because over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of conversations with current clients and potential clients. And one of the most common frustrations, if not the most, in fact, I think it is the most common frustration that I hear from CEOs in particular, is that they've created what they think is a sound strategy with clear strategic goals, and the strategic goals don't get hit. The strategy does not get successfully executed. And I think, assuming that the strategy is sound, which in most cases it is, I think one of the clear reasons this isn't happening is because of how performance management is approached. And so it occurred to me, we talked earlier about how the second step in the 4-step algorithm is identifying what people need to thrive. And there are 14 of these needs that people have for thriving that are essentially universal. And it didn't occur to me until about 6 months ago that 12 of those needs are impacted directly by how performance management is done. and the other two are indirectly impacted by it. So and really this all comes down to coaching, because there's two components to effective performance management. One is the process that we use. Unfortunately, performance management has seemed to take on a new definition in many organizations. It's lost its original purpose. In many organizations, what it's devolved into is essentially a once a year or twice a year judgment of employees, where we're judging what they've done in the past for the purposes of determining whether we should promote them, give them a pay raise, and also to protect the organization from employment lawsuits, right? And all of these things are important, of course, but that has nothing to do with what performance management was originally designed to do, which is help the organization execute the strategy and hit strategic goals, right? So this process, if we have a good process, that's great, and we'll talk about that at a high level here in a second. But then the second component of it is we need managers who are effective coaches to actually bring that process to life. You can have a perfect performance management process, but if managers don't know how to coach, it's still not going to work. So we'll touch very high level on the process, because it does create the foundation for coaching, and then we'll go more in depth into coaching. But the process at a high level, which I think many people understand, it's just easier said than done, is first there has to be really clear what is our mission. And then if we're going to have an annual strategy or strategic goals, how do those help us achieve our mission, right? So once the C-suite is determined, hey, here are the strategic goals, they need to be cascaded down through every level of management. So the next level needs to see, all right, what are my 2 to 3 strategic goals for the year that are aligned with the C-suite's goals, right? Once the C-suite agrees with that level of management, then that level needs to do the same thing with the next level of management, right? Until we get down to even the most junior manager and his or her direct reports. And once you have a manager who's not an executive, they're not leading other leaders, but they're dealing with individual contributors, even then, this is where it usually breaks down. It usually breaks down at just below the director level or at the junior manager level. People are dealing with individual contributors. Those goals still need to be cascaded, and for a number of reasons, which we'll probably get into at least some of them. But the idea is a manager needs to sit down and say, all right, team, here are our team goals. Here's how they're aligned with the goals of the organization for this year. And then they need to sit down with each individual and say, hey, Wanda, how do you contribute to this? What goals could you set that are aligned and contribute to this, that would make you excited to get up every morning on a Monday and come to work, right? Let's get an agreement on 2 or 3 goals for the year, and then you do that for each quarter. And then I recommend even breaking it down every week. What are the 2 to 3 most important things you're going to get done this week that are aligned with your quarterly goals, that are then aligned with the annual goals, and those are aligned with the strategic goals of the whole organization. Beyond that, a good coach then says, okay, you've basically created the goal. Maybe they give a little bit of input, maybe a little bit of guidance, but you can already see how this is more effective, just intuitively, I would imagine, than if I just tell somebody, here's what you should do, right? If you, Wanda, let's just say hypothetically, I think you're probably a better leader than me, but let's just say you reported to me and you created the goal. You told me, this is what I want to do. I think this would make me stretch and grow, and I could see how it's impacting the organization's goals. I could see how I'm making an impact. How much more bought into that goal are you going to be than if I told you, here's what I want you to do this quarter, right? You created it. Now we could take it a step further and say, Wanda, how are you going to measure progress towards those goals? How are you going to know whether you're on track? i.e., what are the KPIs you should be using? Again, if you create those KPIs and not me, now when we check in on how you're doing, it's not me micromanaging saying, you're not hitting this number that I set out for you. It's you who set the goal, who set the progress, key performance indicators, saying, wow, I'm not on track. What could be in my way? And that's where a good coach says, here's my job. You've created the goals and I agree with them. You've created the KPIs. Now my job as a leader is to help you win. My job is to coach you to success. And that's when we meet, it shouldn't be me judging you on what you did over the last week or the last quarter, the last year. It should be saying, if you didn't hit a goal, what got in your way? What do you need from me? How can I help you make sure you hit the next one? That's what performance management should look like. And that's an introduction to what good coaching looks like, right? Is a coach is there to help people win, not wait till the end of the year and judge them on how well they did. Right?
Well, and you're doing the micro goals, which are also more inspiring and motivating in and of themselves. They keep momentum. We know that. So the kind of steady, regular things that build up to something bigger. You're getting feedback in there. That looks good. I like your plan. Oh, it didn't quite work. Well, it was a good plan. Let's go back to that drawing board. You're getting all of that kind of development that everybody's looking for along the way. I think it might be good to go just a touch into that feedback, because that's where I think the next level of coaching comes in, right? Is most people, according to Gallup's research and others, most people leave feedback conversations feeling judged and demoralized. Very few people, I think it's 25% of individual contributors, if I remember right. You might remember better than me, but somewhere around there. Basically, 1 out of 4 individual contributors feel that they get feedback that is both frequent enough and helpful. Everyone else is feeling like they're being judged and demoralized. And here's the coolest part about this. The reason that happens is because guess who's doing all the talking? The manager. So here's the coolest part about this is you can flip that around. Imagine giving feedback, having feedback conversations with people where they don't feel judged or demoralized, they actually leave feeling inspired and feeling that you care about them and want to help them win. The coolest part about this is that the best way for you to do that is to be lazy. Like, don't give them all the answers. Don't do all the talking. Learn how to ask good questions. So somebody's doing something that you would rather them do it differently, or maybe they didn't hit a goal. You just simply start with questions like, how did the last week work out for you? Tell me some of the things that happened and didn't happen. Why do you think they happened that way or didn't happen that way? If you could do it differently next time, what would you do? Like, you ask questions like this, you ask coaching conversation questions, and all of a sudden, somebody's coming up with their own answers and they don't feel judged by you. They feel like you're there to coach them to win, right? And the beauty of it is, if it's a good conversation, it's just like anybody who comes from sales. A good sales conversation, the salesperson's talking less than 20% of the time, ideally about 10% of the time, and the client's talking the whole time. A good coaching conversation is almost the exact same ratio. You can be lazy. All you have to do is create some systems where you know some good questions to ask. You ask those questions, and probably 75% of the issues, the person's going to resolve themselves without you doing anything. And maybe 25%, you have to jump in and say, well, have you thought of this? That maybe this would help you, right? But even still, it's so clear at that point that your motivation is to coach them to win and not judge them, that they still leave feeling supported. They feel inspired instead of judged and demoralized. Okay, Matt, I get that as a really good description of what it means to actually coach. This notion of co-creating goals with people, checking in with them, giving the feedback, and doing the performance management the way it was always intended. So to go back over the 4 parts of the steps for this repeatable, scalable, inspired greatness, it's shift my mindset as a manager to being a coach. It's bring out the best in people, which means I need to identify what it is individuals need to be at their best. And there are 14 of those potentials. And then I need to get feedback regularly on how well I'm doing meeting those needs. And then I need to respond quickly when I get feedback that says I need to do something differently. And respond is as in a day or two, not as in a week or a month. You say the last is the secret hack. So tell us about that.
Well, it's certainly all important. The move to coaching is the core. But we know from decades of research that what drives employee engagement, i.e., are people thriving at work and bringing out discretionary effort, going above and beyond to accomplish the mission, it's driven by direct managers, whether or not we're meeting the needs people have for thriving. And it's driven mostly by these 14 universal needs. There are individual needs too. Those come out, in quality conversations with direct reports, but you get a lot of mileage just understanding of what these universal needs are, and then getting feedback on how we're meeting them, and then responding to that feedback. I think a week is fine, but where we get to run into issues is if we're talking months and months, or a year, or in some cases never organizations respond to feedback. So just as so you have some understanding of what these needs are. A lot of it, if you're familiar with Gallup's work, a lot of this is similar to what the Q12 states. And they include very simple things, like common sense things, like, do people feel appreciated? Are they finding meaning at work? Are they growing? Do they feel like their manager actually cares about them? Do they have clear expectations? Do they get frequent helpful feedback? Some of these things we've talked about already. Just to make sure, these are easy to find, these 14 universal needs, just to make sure we walk away with something of value here. There are 4 that are core, and every other need kind of falls under these 4. And that is, are people finding meaning at work? Are they growing? Is the environment conducive to excellence, which is good news for us? Earlier, we talked about how this dichotomy of, are we high performance or do we have people that thrive? That's a false dichotomy. People want to do good work. They want to see how they're making an impact. This is an inherent human need. And it's a core universal need people have for thriving at work. And then the 4th one is the environment having a positive overall impact on a person's well-being? So those are the 4 core needs. And the idea is that we want to get regular feedback, ideally on those core 4. If you're a really high performing organization, you might do even smaller micro feedback surveys where you're asking literally just about one need at a time. And here's the hack for being able to respond to that feedback almost immediately within a couple of business days with meaningful action. You just need to plan ahead a little bit and understand, okay, I know what we're going to ask. We know that we should be asking these questions. We know that we should continuously be improving in these areas. And we know that managers drive at least 70% of this. So of course, the HR team and the senior leadership team, they might be able to do some work on the side. It might take them a little bit longer to respond. But managers, who, by the way, drive 70% of employee engagement, should be able to respond within a few business days. And here's how. Because you know what questions you're asking, you can have some type of training ready that managers can watch within a day of receiving their feedback, whether it's a video training, whether it's just some simple text that gives them a new habit that they can start practicing with. And the idea is you give people just 1 or 2 new things to practice with for a week or so, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the longest, I would suggest, so that you actually see behavior change, right? So a manager doesn't feel overwhelmed, like, oh, I just learned 50 things. Like, I imagine a lot of people, they hear 14 universal needs and they think, oh my gosh, I could barely do 2 things at once. How am I going to consistently meet 14 universal needs? Well, the answer is you got to do it gradually over time. So all this works together to create this really synergistic effect where you can learn in the best way to learn, which is instead of learning a bunch of information and trying to retain all of it, you learn a little bit of information and do a lot of practice to build a new skill, turn it into a habit before you learn something new. But this also helps you to respond to the feedback almost instantly. Because if I get feedback on a Thursday and I get some type of training on a Friday that says, hey, regardless of whether your feedback was 5 out of 5 or 1 out of 5, here's something you can do to either get a little bit better if this is a strength of yours, or maybe try to move to average if this is a significant weakness, that you can start doing immediately. Just 1, maybe 2 simple things. And then you need to build high levels of accountability around that to make sure people actually take some action on that, have systems in place that make it very hard for them to fail, where they They're going to at least do something a little bit every day for a couple of weeks. Now what happens? Employees see feedback in a matter of days, or see meaningful response to their feedback in a matter of days. And in many organizations, I mean, this is mind blowing. People are like, man, it's usually we wait 6 to 12 months to see any type of meaningful action. We're seeing it in days. This is pretty cool. And then the other thing that happens is managers can learn and develop in a way that's actually sustainable because they're getting little bits at a time in this digestible.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And if you go back to those 14 needs, there might be 3, 4, 5 tactics to address any one of those 14 needs. If you have that sort of prep for managers so they can go, oh, this is the one I want to focus on, let me try that with people, it's not an impossible task to build. I mean,
right. I mean, in a year, you should be able to be average at meeting all 14 of these universal needs. And that's all that we, if somebody's really has a lot of room for growth, we don't expect them to be a 5 out of 5 at that area. We'd like to get them to average. And what we want to do is leverage people's strengths. Say, look, you're already good at this. How about how can you continuously get maybe 1% better? Because that's where you're going to see people put in the most energy. But as long as you can get to average, then you're at least meeting that need. Maybe not excelling at meeting the need, but you're doing it. You can, in a year, you could go from maybe only meeting 1 or 2 of these universal needs consistently to meeting all of them consistently. Right. It's very realistic.
Yeah, and what's interesting about those 14 is that they are not boiling the ocean. So I think that that's a quite reasonable process. So I like this process, Matt. I see why you say the shift is to being a coach. So my primary job is to inspire greatness in the team so that I'm coaching people to thrive. And then I'm addressing what it is they need to thrive. And then I'm getting feedback about how well I'm doing it. And then I'm consistently improving on how I'm doing it. Rinse and repeat. And we've got a great leadership development journey for everybody at any level.
Which could be self-directed or it could be facilitated by an HR team or leadership development team, learning and development team in the company. But yeah, you've got to I know you probably thought it might have sounded like just a sales pitch that we couldn't live up to, but it's you've got a simple, repeatable, scalable process for bringing out the best in the people in your organization.
And bring out the best in your leaders as well. I love it. All right, my guest today, Matt Tenney. The book we're talking about is Inspire Greatness. And Matt, if people want to find you, where should they reach you?
Well, I'm pretty Googleable. Matt Tenney is the name. MattTenney. You'll find lots of things to. Probably the first one will be the website matttenney.com, but.
Yes, and also a fabulous TED Talk. Hey, thanks for joining us. I love the tips. It's been a good conversation, a really fun conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks again for having me, Wanda.
Thank you. And join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.